Dr. Umar Munshi to share his perspective.
All right, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Right. My name, I'll do a quick reintroduction maybe. So my name is Umar Munshi. I'll go to my topic in a short while. The topic is a little bit heavy for me in the sense that I'm not a Sharia scholar. But what I am is, Alhamdulillah, I've been an entrepreneur for 22 years, ever since I was much younger, all the way until today. Originally from Singapore, but I spent quite a few years in Indonesia, and in the last 6 years, I've been based in Malaysia. And for the past 12 years, I've been in Islamic finance as an entrepreneur. Right? So in Malaysia, there are a lot of people in Islamic finance around the world as well, but not too many who start new businesses or disruptive businesses within the space of Islamic finance. So I guess that's where maybe I have a little bit of a unique experience and perspective to share. So let me share my screen. Hopefully it works for me. Yeah, and before I jump into this, I just want to say thank you to the organizers and for everybody attending for the opportunity. And definitely the previous session was quite inspiring and quite amazing also. For me, what I have been working on is up fintech platforms. We are regulated in multiple jurisdictions. Our focus is matching funds or investors to real world projects and companies, right? Or another phrase you can use is alternative investments or private capital market investments. Right? That's what we do. And today we have a VC fund focused on halal startups called Halal Hasan VC. And we have a number of different regulated crowdfunding and investment platforms in various markets and countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, in the GCC as well. Now, the topic today is about, let me just get the exact topic so I don't read it wrongly. Yeah, so my exact topic today is ethical guidelines provided in the Quran and Hadith related to commerce for fair and transparent transactions. So it's very specific topic, and I've summarized or picked out picked out a few 3 verses from the Holy Quran, as well as 3 Hadith, along with the translations and some simple elaboration points. So maybe what I'll do is I'll run through the 6 different Quranic verses or verses from the Quran and also the Hadith. And then I'll dive into a little bit more of my own reflections and my own thoughts, inshallah, that I hope will be interesting and valuable for everyone. So the first is from Surah An-Nisa, and I'll just jump to the translation. O you who believe, do not consume one another's wealth unjustly, but only in lawful business by mutual consent. Right? So it's very straightforward in the sense that it's very clear. Right? Do not do things that are not lawful. Do things that both parties agree on. Right? So this is a very fundamental point that I'm sure anyone would be able to resonate with. Right? And as I stated up here, what Islam teaches us is very simple and powerful principles. Because they are simple and powerful principles, these principles are essentially timeless. Right? They can be implemented in the context of when these verses came out more than 1,400 years ago, and in today's modern economy, which with all its different complexities as well. Right. So here, this is the first one about mutual consent and being consuming wealth fairly. Right. Now, the next one is from Surah Al-Isra, translated, and give full measure when you measure. Right? Don't cut corners. Right? Don't give less than what you're supposed to, and weigh with an even balance. Right? So it elaborates furthermore. In addition to giving full measure, you have to ensure that the mechanism is also accurate, and this is the best way and the best result. And so not only is this what you should do or the best thing to do, but it also gives the best outcome, right? So here it's of course when you look at result, there is the angle or the perspective of the business result, but definitely based on the faith lens, the lens of faith, it's also the best result in this world and the next, right? So again, a very fundamental, I would say, a very basic principle that stresses on, again, similar to previous points, about being just and being fair and fulfilling the expectation or the responsibility, so that both parties have their rights looked after. Another verse from the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Mutaffifin: woe to those who give less than due, who when they take measure from people, take full measure, but when they give by measure or by weight to them, they cause loss, right? So again, it's about being fair to both sides, to both parties, and not essentially, in this case, not cheating, right? Not giving less than what is supposed to be or what is agreed to be the transaction itself, right? And here, the first few are about more of guidance and instructions. Here it is, in a sense, a strong warning, right? It's a warning that this cannot be done and should not be done, right? So I think it's very clear from the Quran, and there are many other similar verses of the Quran. And again, I'm not a Sharia scholar or expert in the Quran or a Hadith, but based on the clarity of what is provided to us in the Quran, and the Quran is meant to be for everyone, for humanity, and it's meant to be something that anyone can read. At the same time, there are many layers and dimensions to the Quran, which I'm not qualified to go into. But just on this surface understanding of the Quran is very clear that Islam stresses very strongly on being fair, on being just, and not only in terms of principle, but in terms of the actual implementation of the commercial transaction, the method of the commercial transaction, right? And the expectations of both sides, in this case, the understanding and the agreement between the different parties. Now, let me go on to 3 hadith, right? This is the first one from Sahih Bukhari. The seller and the buyer have the option. So here's more specific, right? It's very interesting. This is stated by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his narrations or hadith. And this is a Sahih hadith, meaning it's something that is verified and considered to be highly credible, right? So the seller and the buyer have the option, right, to cancel the transaction as long as they have not parted or until they part. Meaning, when we are negotiating, discussing, right, as long as we have not, separated from each other, we can still cancel the transaction. So here, in both ways, it highlights, as stated here, the right to cancel, right? That means while you're still there, it is an ongoing discussion. But once you have parted, right? That means you have agreed on the transaction and then you have parted. That transaction or that agreement is very important, right? That agreement is something that has weight, right? You should not change your mind. Of course, you can always renegotiate in that sense. But once an agreement is made, the word is given, or the agreement is signed, then we have to uphold that agreement, right? Now let me go on to two others. Also, this one is very simple, very very straightforward, mashallah. Sahih Muslim, from Sahih Muslim, whoever cheats is not one of us, right? And it's so simple. It's simply profound, in my view, because when you do business, when you are transacting, when you're interacting with other people, whether as an individual or as part of a business or a company or an employee, there's sometimes there's gray areas, right? And there's areas um, where you can choose to sort of compromise or cut corners, right? So here is very clear that Muslims do not cheat, right? So if you subscribe to Islamic teachings, if you consider yourself a Muslim, if you are practicing Muslim, you should not cheat. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Islam is meant to be a way of life or teaching for everyone, right? Of course, for Muslims, we treat this, in a different lens, right? But for all of humanity, I'm sure this is a universal point that we should not cheat, right? We should not be dishonest. Okay. Let me go on to the last two hadith that I have compiled for today. Here is about consent, right? From Sunan, this is the last one, I think. Yeah, last one. Right? So it's not lawful for the wealth of a Muslim to be taken except with his willing consent. Right. So here it goes back to the principle that was initially highlighted in the verses of the Holy Quran, where the agreement component or the consent component is very important, right? And this is implemented, in general, in any context, right? Because here it's a more, I would say, a more general context, right, where the rights of a person's wealth or belongings lies with that person, right, and other parties cannot, uh, at their own volition, decide on behalf of the other party if you do not have the right to do so. Yeah. So this is very, very important. And these are fundamentals, right? So let me just recap the fundamental points that I highlighted earlier. There are 5 points here. And maybe then I'll talk a little bit about my own experience in our own uh, uh, in business, basically what I've encountered over more than 2 decades of doing business, right? So first is mutual consent. It must be agreement. There must be consent, right? There must be clarity in terms of both parties agreeing to something, and this is today, of course, something that is implemented in general. For example, if there were to be a dispute and you go to court, right? This component of not being coerced or forced into something, or not omitting important information. Right? For us in the investment world, where we are dealing with a little bit of a tricky subject matter for my company, Ethis, where we are connecting people, investors, institutions, to small businesses, to startups, to trade transactions, and so on. This is not a public listed stock, for example, or this is not a bond or sukuk, right? It's not a financial product. It's where you're connecting two parties who are not connected, right? And we are just the connector or the matchmaker, right? So to what extent does the entrepreneur or the business need to disclose the information, right? What is material and what is not? What is omission and what is misleading, right? So this is the points here, the fundamental points here are so important in what we do, because we are connecting individuals to the real world activities, right? The real economy, and the investors don't always understand what's really going on, right? So this part is very important, right? And all the other parts come into play as well. Of course, they overlap and they reinforce each other. Yeah. So back to the point of how we do things. Of course, there are regulatory guidelines. but it goes back to also the integrity of the party, for example, the investee or the beneficiary company, right? Or in our case, we typically call them the issuers because they issue shares to the investors or they issue investment notes to the investors, right? Because typically we're considered a capital market platform. Right? So we are not the financial institution. We're not taking the funds and deciding what to do with it. Most of the time, we are just a connector. So that's where the integrity on both sides is very important. And when we speak to the issuers or the fundraisers, we will do our part to evaluate and to ask questions and to probe and to question what the information that's provided. But at the end of the day, because we are not the expert in that business, the investor is also not the expert in that business. That's where the business owner needs to have integrity in terms of providing information that they know is material or relevant or important. Yeah. So the integrity part, of course, is very, very critical. And these are more, more specific points that were mentioned earlier. Fair measure and weight. Now, when you extrapolate this to an investment transaction, is there here is typically in the context of trade, right? But in the modern world today, trade can be expanded to many different ways or implemented in many different ways. In our case, we match investors to companies. For example, if you startups, right? We have an angel group, we have equity crowdfunding platforms where we match investors to companies. We also have a VC fund where we take on that responsibility as the fund manager. Now, in any case, in the context of investing in startups, the valuation is very subjective, right? So, what's a fair valuation? What's a fair amount of shares given to investors for putting in a certain amount of money? Right? It's very, very subjective, right? And there are many ways of doing it. There is a science behind it, but it's also definitely an art. And again, it goes a lot of times, especially today, if we do a valuation of a startup compared to 3 years ago, it'll be very different because back then the markets were very hot. Today the market is low. The valuations are low, right? So there are many factors that come in to decide on whether a valuation is fair or whether a transaction is fair to both sides, right? Because if the valuation is too low, then it's going to be unfair to the entrepreneur. If the valuation is too high, it may not be fair to the investor, right? And for startups, for technology companies and startups that are deemed to be high growth, high potential, highly scalable, the valuation is based on the future, right? Now, I just want to touch on this a little bit because I believe in the Muslim world, especially in Islamic finance, this area of startup investment or VC investment or angel investment is very new. It's new but fast emerging, right? It's I wouldn't say it's booming, but it's because the base is low, right? The size is small. There's a lot of interest, even though the general VC market is in, I would say, a correction phase, mainly brought upon by the Silicon Valley being so too aggressive in such that a bubble was built. But fundamentally today in the Muslim world, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the GCC, in Saudi especially, startups and venture capital is growing very, very fast. And there's a lot of interest from angel investors. So this is a very tricky topic, right, in terms of valuation and so on. And for us, we always try our best to make sure both sides understand. Now, one thing that is not inside not in the set of Hadith and Quran that was mentioned here in Islamic finance is a very important component is risk sharing, as opposed to traditionally or conventionally risk transfer. Right? In Islam, I'm digressing a little bit, but I think this is very relevant. In Islam, money is not viewed as an asset in itself, in the sense that if I have funds and I want to provide it to someone as a loan, I cannot get benefit from that transaction, right? I cannot provide a loan and benefit from it. That is haram. But I can invest, meaning I can partake in the business activity, right? So when it comes to Islamic investment or halal investment, the investment needs to be participatory, and the risk is something that is shared. Unless, for example, it's a trade, then you know the prices and so on. So there's not much variance there, but still you are participating in the risk of the trade maybe not being fulfilled properly, right? Now, if you're talking about equity investment in startups, then here is where we are investing in equity and taking in the full risk of that startup, right? Now, it's tricky when we know statistically and fundamentally, majority of startups are going to fail. Right? Majority, not just a small portion. Because that's the nature of trying to do a disruptive high growth business. It's reinventing the wheel, and most times that wheel will break, right? But those that do make it, when you reinvent the wheel, then you're flying to the moon, as they like to say. So here's where we need to also provide education that while valuations can be sometimes startups they are very passionate about their own company and projects, so they're asking for high valuations. But we also have to make them understand that the investors are taking a significant risk, right? And investors need to understand that they are taking significant risk, right? Now, I'm very passionate about this topic, so I can go on and on, but cognizant of time, I will just summarize the last 2 points here. The second last point is a very specific point, as I shared earlier, is about the right to cancel. Okay, so I won't go into that too much. But this is in today's world can be tricky sometimes, because the akad, or the agreement, the point where an agreement is locked in, can be a little bit vague when you are dealing in the online world, right? When I click add to cart, am I buying? When I transact and it's completed in the system, but it's not cut off from my debit card. So is that considered transacted? When I tick a checkbox, and is that an agreement or not? Right. So this is a very important point. But the fundamental point remains, and the fundamental point is clear, that is based on mutual understanding and mutual agreement, right? Now, the last point here is about something I mentioned also previously about wealth transfer or rights to wealth, where consent has to be obtained. And in today's world, we have things like data, right? In the past, this concept wasn't there, but today you have data, right? So all these PDPA regulations and so on, this is something that is really fundamentally stated in Islam clearly, that you cannot take someone's property, or you cannot use someone's property without consent, right? So I think in today's world, this is even more important when it comes to this world of data. And in future, as we move forward into a world where blockchain or Web3, today is a trendier phrase, Web3 becomes more widespread, where AI is everywhere, is ubiquitous, right? And AI can take and use data, and already there are issues there. So this fundamental point becomes a big issue today, right? About consent when it comes to wealth transfer. So I hope, that's the end of my presentation. And my objective was, again, I'm sharing wisdom and information that is there in the Islam, in Quran and Hadith, trying to relate it to today's world, so that hopefully it triggers some thoughts, and for all of us to ponder over, and inshallah help us to have a more ethical approach to commerce, to transactions, to business, and engaging with each other in today's modern world. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Umar Munshi. So, Alhamdulillah, very insightful information, especially pertaining to the contemporary issues, especially on data. So from the first speaker, we have heard about sustainable entrepreneurship, and now we have just heard about fair and transparent transaction. And now, last but not least, we shall move to the third speaker, Dr. Zalina, on importance of Islamic